Get your cheap suitcases and get out of this house before the rain ruins what is left of your pride, Clara." My mother's voice shrieked through the morning fog, sharp enough to shatter glass. She was standing on the sidewalk, her arms folded tightly over a designer cardigan, her face twisted into a mask of pure contempt. Beside her, my father stood with his hands in his pockets, his chin tilted upward as if he were watching a nuisance finally being cleared from his property. It was just after 6 a.m. and the world was a dull, bruised gray. The pounding on my front door had started 5 minutes earlier. It was a heavy, rhythmic thud that vibrated through the floorboards and into my bones. I had scrambled out of bed, my heart racing at 100 beats per minute, thinking there was an emergency. But as I peered through the window, I didn't see fire trucks or ambulances. I saw a county sheriff's patrol car sitting at the curb with its lights dark, and a man in a tan uniform standing on my porch with a clipboard pressed against his chest. Before I show you the cold, hard evidence that turned their smug smiles into ash, make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. Also, let me know in the comments which part of the country you are watching from today. I love seeing how far these stories travel. I opened the door only as far as the security chain would allow. The morning air was biting, a cold dampness that seeped through my thin sweatshirt. The man on the porch was Deputy Miller. He looked tired, his eyes reflecting a man who had spent too many years delivering bad news to people who didn't deserve it. "Are you Clara Ward?" he asked, his voice low and professional. "Yes," I replied, my voice sounding small even to my own ears. "What is going on?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he adjusted the papers on his clipboard and pulled one to the front. "I am here to execute a writ of possession," he said. "This is a court-ordered eviction. You have 1 hour to remove your personal belongings. At 7 a.m., I am authorized to remove you from the premises and change the locks." The word eviction hit me like a physical blow to the chest, knocking the air right out of my lungs. "This is my house," I said, my voice rising as the shock began to give way to a cold, trembling anger. My grandfather left this house to me in his will. He lived here for 40 years. I have been the one paying the taxes and the insurance. There has to be a mistake. Deputy Miller didn't flinch. He reached into the stack of papers and pulled out a copy of the order, angling it so I could see the bold letters at the top. "I am not here to argue the merits of the case, ma'am. My job is to enforce the order signed by the judge. The plaintiff in this case has provided the necessary documentation to prove ownership and your failure to vacate." I looked past him, my eyes locking onto my parents across the street. My mother was smiling now, a small, thin-lipped expression of triumph. She reached up and adjusted the pearl necklace she was wearing, the one my grandfather had bought for my grandmother, the one she had snatched from his jewelry box before his body was even cold. My father checked his gold watch and nodded at the deputy, a silent signal to get on with it. "You should have listened when we offered you a way out, Clara." My father called out, his voice carrying easily across the quiet suburban street. "We told you this house belonged in the hands of someone who could actually manage the family assets. You were just a temporary occupant. Now move your things before we have the charity trucks come and haul them away." I looked back at the paperwork in the deputy's hand. My eyes scanned the lines until I found the section labeled Plaintiff. My breath hitched in my throat. Mark Ward and Diane Ward. My own parents had gone behind my back, filed a lawsuit in a county courthouse, and convinced a judge that I was a squatter in my own home. "Can I see the signature on the service of process?" I asked, my mind starting to move with a sudden, desperate speed. I was never served. I never received a single notice about a court date. I didn't even know there was a lawsuit. Deputy Miller sighed a sound of weary pity. "The record shows that service was completed 3 weeks ago at 4422 Pine Street. It was accepted by an adult female resident who identified herself as the defendant." 4422 Pine Street, I whispered. I haven't lived there since I was 6 years old. That was a rental property they sold a decade ago. I looked at my mother again. She was the only one who could have known about that address, the only one who could have stood on a porch and lied to a process server while pretending to be me. She hadn't just stolen my house, she had stolen my identity to do it. I didn't scream. I didn't give them the satisfaction of a breakdown. I stepped back from the door and began to unbolt the chain. If I have 1 hour, I'm going to use every second of it, I told the deputy. He nodded once, stepping aside to let me pass back into the hallway. I'll be waiting right here on the porch, he said. Just keep it quiet. I don't want to have to call for backup because of a neighborhood disturbance. As I closed the door, I could hear my mother's laughter echoing from across the street. She thought she had won. She thought that by the time the sun was high in the sky, she would be walking through these rooms, cataloging my grandfather's antiques and deciding which ones to sell on the internet. But as I stood in the darkened hallway of the home I loved, I realized they had made one fatal mistake. They thought I was still the little girl who would cry and hide when they raised their voices. They forgot that my grandfather had spent the last 5 years of his life teaching me how to protect what was mine. I didn't go for my clothes. I didn't go for my shoes. I went straight to the small built-in library in the back of the house. I reached behind the row of leather-bound architecture books and pressed the hidden latch my grandfather had installed 40 years ago. The panel clicked open, revealing a small fireproof floor safe. My hands were shaking, but my mind was a sharp, cold blade. I punched in the code my grandfather's birthday and the heavy door swung open. Inside was a thick manila envelope. I pulled it out and felt the weight of the original notarized deed to the property, the one with the county recorder's official embossed seal. Underneath it was a copy of the probate distribution letter clearly stating that the property at 1224 Oak Lane was to pass directly to Clara Ward, bypassing any other heirs. I sat on the floor, the cold hardwood biting into my legs, and pulled out my phone. I began to take high-resolution photos of every single page. I didn't just need the deed, I needed the documents they had used to lie. I opened the digital folder on my phone, where I kept my work records. I scanned the dates. 3 weeks ago, on the day they claimed I was served at a house across town, I had been in the middle of a 12-hour shift at the firm, preparing for the city council presentation. I looked at the clock. It was 6:15 a.m. I had 45 minutes before my life was supposed to end. I grabbed my laptop and my briefcase, ignoring the sounds of a moving truck backing into the driveway. My father was already directing the movers to start with the patio furniture. I checked the eviction paperwork again, specifically the lease agreement my parents had filed as evidence. It claimed I was a tenant who had defaulted on a monthly rent of $2,000. I stared at the signature at the bottom. It was a loop of ink that looked nothing like my handwriting. They hadn't just lied, they had committed a felony. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I had hoped I would never have to call. It was for a man named Elias Thorne, an old friend of my grandfather's who specialized in property law and white-collar fraud. Elias. "It's Clara," I said as soon as he picked up. "I'm standing in my living room and there is a sheriff on my porch. My parents just served me with a fraudulent writ of possession. I have the original deed in my hand and proof that the service was faked. How fast can you get a judge to sign an emergency stay?" There was a long silence on the other end, followed by the sound of a chair creaking. "Clara, stay calm," he said, his voice like velvet over gravel. "Don't resist the deputy. If they move your furniture, let them move it. But get me those photos now. If they forged a deed or a lease, they didn't just take your house, they handed me the rope to hang them with." I hung up and sent the files, my heart hammering against my ribs. I walked to the front window and pulled the curtain back just an inch. My mother was now on my porch talking to Deputy Miller. She was pointing at the door, her face red with impatience. She wanted in. She wanted to see the look on my face when I was forced out into the mud. I grabbed my car keys and my briefcase. I didn't need a suitcase. I needed a courtroom. I walked to the door and opened it wide, coming face to face with the woman who had spent 23 years pretending to love me while eyeing my inheritance. "You're still here," my mother hissed, her eyes darting to the briefcase in my hand. "I thought I told you to pack." "I'm leaving," I said, my voice as steady as a mountain. "But I'm not going where you think." My father walked up the steps, his chest puffed out. "Where you go isn't our concern anymore, Clara. Just make sure you're off the property by 7. We have a lot of work to do to get this place ready for the market." I looked at Deputy Miller. I am leaving voluntarily to avoid a scene, I told him. But I wanted on the record that I am disputing this order based on fraudulent service and a forged lease. I will be at the courthouse when the doors open. The deputy nodded, his expression unreadable. Noted, ma'am. My mother laughed, a sharp, jagged sound that filled the morning air. Go to the courthouse, then. Waste your time. The judge has already ruled. It's over, Clara. We win. I didn't answer her. I walked down the steps past the movers who were already unloading blankets to wrap my grandfather's chairs. I got into my car and started the engine, the heater blowing cold air against my frozen fingers. As I backed out of the driveway, I saw my father reaching for the door handle of my house, his hand gripping the brass knob as if he already owned every inch of the space inside. I drove toward the city, the sky finally beginning to bleed into a pale, sickly yellow. My mind was a whirlwind of dates, signatures, and legal statutes. I wasn't just thinking about the house anymore. I was thinking about the 40% of the story they didn't know, the parts my grandfather had told me in whispers during those final months. The parts about the money my father had borrowed from the estate years ago, and the reason they were so desperate for the equity in this Victorian. They thought they were playing a game of checkers, but they didn't realize I had been playing chess since the day I turned 18. I pulled into the parking lot of the county recorder's office 20 minutes before they opened. I sat there watching the clock on the dashboard tick toward the moment I would begin to dismantle their lives piece by piece. My phone buzzed with a text from Elias. I've seen the lease. It's a joke. They used an old notary stamp that expired 3 years ago. Meet me at Department 14. The judge on duty today is a stickler for protocol, and he's going to hate what your parents have done to his courtroom. I felt a ghost of a smile touch my lips. My parents wanted a war, and they wanted it to happen at 6 in the morning when I was at my weakest. But the sun was up now, and I was wide awake. I stepped out of the car, the briefcase heavy in my hand. I could still see the image of my mother wearing those stolen pearls, her face glowing with the thrill of her own cruelty. She thought she was the hero of this story, the savvy businesswoman taking back what she was owed. She had no idea that she had just walked into a trap that had been set 40 years ago. I walked toward the heavy stone steps of the courthouse, my heels clicking against the pavement with a sound like a ticking clock. Every step was a promise. Every breath was a countdown. By the time this day was over, my parents wouldn't be worried about a house. They would be worried about how they were going to stay out of a prison cell. The doors to the courthouse groaned open, and I stepped into the cool marble lobby. The smell of floor wax and old wood met me, a familiar scent that felt more like home than the house I had just been kicked out of. Justice was a slow machine, but once it started moving, it didn't stop for anyone, especially not for people like Mark and Diane Ward. Elias Thorne was waiting for me near the elevators, standing tall, despite his 70 years. He looked exactly like a man who had spent 4 decades dismantling corporate giants, wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my first car, and carrying an aura of absolute, unshakable authority. When he saw me walking toward him with my briefcase clutched to my chest, his expression softened for a fraction of a second before his professional mask clicked back into place. "Give me the paperwork, Clara," he said, his voice a deep, comforting rumble. I handed him the folder I had put together in the car. We stood in the middle of the bustling marble hallway, people rushing past us toward family court and traffic hearings. But Elias didn't move. He flipped through the photos of the eviction order, the proof of service, and the forged lease agreement. His eyes narrowed as he reached the page with the notary's stamp. "Sarah Jenkins," he muttered, tracing the name with his thumb. "I know that name. She's a freelance notary who does work for your father's investment firm. And if I remember correctly, the Secretary of State suspended her commission 6 months ago for failing to keep a proper journal." I felt a surge of hope so strong it made my knees weak. If the notary was already under investigation, the entire foundation of their case was built on quicksand. "Elias, they claimed I was served at the Pine Street house on the 14th, I said, leaning in closer. "I have my badge logs from the firm. I was in a secure building from 8 in the morning until 8 at night that day. I have parking garage timestamps and 3 different co-workers who can swear I never left for lunch." He nodded, a sharp, predatory glint appearing in his eyes. "Good. That is the service of process. Now let's talk about this lease. They are claiming you owe $10,000 in back rent based on a monthly rate of $2,000. Did you ever sign anything? Never, I said firmly. My grandfather gave me the deed 3 years ago as a graduation present. He wanted me to have a home that no one could take away. He knew my father was struggling with his commercial real estate projects, and he didn't want the house to be used as collateral for another one of his failing ventures. Elias gestured for me to follow him toward the civil division counter. We need to pull the original file, he said. I want to see the physical ink on that quitclaim deed. If they recorded a transfer of title, they had to submit an original document to the county recorder's office. The line at the clerk's window was long filled with people holding folders and looking defeated by the bureaucracy of it all. But when Elias stepped up to the glass and flashed his bar card, the clerk's demeanor changed instantly. He spoke in quiet, urgent tones, and 10 minutes later, a thick manila folder was placed on the counter between us. Elias opened it with the care of an archaeologist. We skipped past the eviction notices and went straight to the back. There it was, a quitclaim deed dated 2 weeks ago, purporting to transfer the property at 1224 Oak Lane from Clara Ward to Mark and Diane Ward for the sum of $10 and other valuable consideration. I stared at the signature at the bottom of the page. It was a beautiful flowing script that looked almost exactly like mine, except for the way the second A in Clara connected to the W in Ward. I always lift my pen there. I've done it that way since middle school. Whoever forged this had spent time practicing, but they hadn't spent enough time watching me actually write. Look at the notary acknowledgement, Elias whispered, pointing to the bottom corner. I looked at the circular purple stamp. It looked official, but as I squinted at the fine print, I saw it. The expiration date for the commission had been clumsily altered with a fine tip pen. It said 2026, but the ink was a slightly different shade of black than the rest of the stamp. Underneath the scratch, I could see the faint shadow of a 4. Her commission had expired in 2024. They filed a forged deed with an expired notary stamp to initiate an unlawful detainer action against a legal owner. Elias said, a cold smile spreading across his face. That is not just a civil matter, Clara. That is a felony in this state. They didn't just walk into a courtroom. They walked into a trap of their own making. I felt a vibration in my pocket. I pulled out my phone and saw a series of notifications from my home security app. I opened the live feed and felt my blood run cold. My mother was inside my house. She was standing in the middle of the living room holding a trash bag, and she was currently pulling my grandfather's hand-carved clock off the mantel. My father was right behind her, pointing at the sofa and gesturing to the movers to take it toward the door. "They're clearing the house," I said, showing the screen to Elias. My voice was trembling with rage. "They are treating my grandfather's things like garbage." Elias took the phone from my hand, watched the screen for 5 seconds, and then handed it back. "Let them," he said. "Every item they touch, every box they move is another line in the lawsuit I am going to file against them. They think they are taking possession. In reality, they are just documenting their own trespassing and theft." He turned back to the clerk. "I need a certified copy of this entire file, and I need a hearing slip for Judge Miller in Department 14. We are filing an emergency motion to stay the writ and vacate the judgment based on extrinsic fraud." The clerk's eyebrows shot up. "Fraud. Extensive calculated and documented fraud," Elias replied, his voice booming through the office. "And tell the judge's assistant that we have live video evidence of the plaintiffs committing grand larceny as we speak." We spent the next 45 minutes in a small, glass-walled room reserved for attorneys. Elias was on his laptop, his fingers flying across the keys as he drafted the motion. I was on my phone recording the live stream from my house and saving the clips to the cloud. I watched as my mother threw my architectural sketches into a box without any care, folding the thick vellum paper I had spent hundreds of hours on. I watched as my father sat at my grandfather's dining table and poured himself a drink from a crystal decanter that had been in our family for 3 generations. They looked so comfortable, so entitled. It was as if the 23 years of my life had been nothing more than a long-term rental agreement that they had finally decided to terminate. There was no hesitation in their movements, no guilt in their expressions. They truly believed that because they had given me life, everything I owned belonged to them by right of blood. I called my boss Sarah at the firm. My voice was tight, but I kept it professional. Sarah, I'm at the courthouse. My parents are attempting to seize my property using forged documents. I need a formal notarized letter from HR confirming my badge logs and my physical presence in the office on the 14th, and I need the lobby camera footage from that morning. Consider it done. Sarah said, her voice filled with a motherly indignation that I hadn't expected. I'll have the digital files sent to your attorney's email in 15 minutes, and I'll have a courier bring the hard copies to the courthouse. Do you need me to come down there and testify? Not yet, I said, but stay close to your phone. I hung up and looked at Elias. He was printing the motion now, the heavy paper sliding out of the portable printer he kept in his briefcase. He stapled the pages together with a sharp metallic sound that felt like a gavel striking a bench. We have the work logs, the lobby footage, the expired notary commission, and the video of the illegal move, Elias said, sliding the documents into a leather folder. Now we just need the judge to see what I see. We walked toward Department 14, the quietest part of the courthouse, where the high-stakes property disputes were settled. The hallway was lined with dark wood paneling and smelled of floor wax and old law books. It was a place of silence and procedure, a place where a single misplaced comma could cost a man a fortune. As we reached the heavy double doors of the courtroom, the judge's assistant stepped out. She was a woman in her 50s with sharp glasses and a no-nonsense bun. She looked at Elias and then at me, her eyes lingering on my briefcase. "Mr. Thorne," she said, "the judge has reviewed your preliminary filing. He is not happy about being interrupted during a trial, but he is even less happy about the allegations of fraud in his jurisdiction." "Is he on the bench?" Elias asked. "He is taking a 15-minute recess," she replied, gesturing toward the doors. "He wants to see both of you in his chambers, and he wants to know why the sheriff's department is currently standing on a porch at 1224 Oak Lane watching a theft in progress." I followed Elias into the courtroom, my heart pounding in my ears. The room was empty except for a court reporter and a bailiff who was leaning against the wall. We walked through the swinging gate and toward the door behind the bench. Inside the chambers, Judge Miller was sitting behind a massive oak desk, his robes draped over the back of his chair. He was a man who looked like he had seen everything and believed none of it. He held my grandfather's deed in one hand and the forged quitclaim in the other. "Miss Ward," he said, his voice as dry as parchment, "your attorney claims that you were never served and that this signature is a forgery. He also claims that the notary involved has a commission that expired 2 years ago. These are very serious charges. If you are lying to me, you will leave this room in handcuffs." I looked him straight in the eye, the fear that had been haunting me since 6 a.m. suddenly evaporating. "Your Honor, I was at work 40 miles away when that service was allegedly accepted. I have the badge logs and the security footage to prove I never left the building. And if you look at the signature on that deed, you will see it lacks a specific lift in the pen that I have used for a decade. My parents are in my house right now, removing my grandfather's estate." The judge turned to his assistant. "Call the sheriff's civil unit. Tell them to stay the execution of the writ immediately. And call the plaintiffs. Tell them I want them in this courtroom in 1 hour. Tell them to bring their attorney and the notary, Sarah Jenkins." I felt a shiver of cold, hard satisfaction. The machine was moving. The gears were turning. And my parents, who were currently clinking glasses in my living room, had no idea that the walls were closing in. Elias leaned over and whispered in my ear, "This is the moment they lose everything, Clara. Just stay quiet and let the evidence do the screaming." I sat down in the hard wooden chair in the gallery, watching the clock on the wall. Each tick of the second hand felt like a drumbeat. I thought about my mother's designer cardigan and my father's gold watch. I thought about the years they had spent looking down at me, treating me like a child who didn't understand the real world. They were about to find out that the real world was governed by rules they couldn't charm or bully their way out of. The doors to the courtroom opened 40 minutes later. My parents walked in, looking annoyed and slightly disheveled from the move. My mother was still wearing her pearls, and my father was carrying a leather portfolio as if he were attending a business meeting. They were followed by a man in a cheap suit who I assumed was their lawyer. When my mother saw me sitting in the front row, she didn't look afraid. She looked disgusted. "Clara, honestly," she said, her voice echoing in the quiet room, "this is embarrassing. You're making a scene over a house you can't even afford to maintain. We are trying to help you." "Sit down, Mrs. Ward," the bailiff barked, pointing to the plaintiff's table. My father sat down, leaning back and crossing his legs. He looked at Elias and gave a small, mocking nod. "Elias, I haven't seen you since the funeral. I hope you aren't charging my daughter too much for this little tantrum." Elias didn't even look at him. He was busy arranging his documents on the table, his movements slow and deliberate. The door behind the bench opened and the bailiff called the room to order. Judge Miller walked in, his face set in a grim expression that made the room go cold. He didn't look at me, and he didn't look at my parents. He looked at the folder in front of him as if it were a piece of evidence in a murder trial. "We are here on an emergency motion regarding the property at 1224 Oak Lane." The judge began, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. "Counsel, I have reviewed the filings. I want to hear from the plaintiffs first. Mr. Ward, you submitted a notarized quitclaim deed as evidence of ownership. Can you explain why the notary's commission on that document appears to be expired?" My father's confident posture flickered for a second. "Your Honor, I'm sure there's just a clerical error with the stamp. The notary, Miss Jenkins, has been a trusted associate for years." "A trusted associate?" The judge repeated, his voice dropping an octave. "And did this trusted associate witness your daughter's signature on the 14th of last month?" "Absolutely," my mother chimed in, her voice sounding high and frantic. "We were all there. It was a very emotional family meeting. Clara realized that the house was too much for her and signed it over to us to settle some old family debts." I felt Elias's hand on my arm, a silent command to stay still. I watched as my mother lied to a man who had spent his life detecting deception. She was good at it. The slight tremor in her voice, the way she touched her pearls, the look of motherly concern. If I didn't have the proof in my briefcase, I might have almost believed her myself. "And where did this meeting take place?" the judge asked, leaning forward. "At the house on Pine Street," my father said, regaining his footing. "We met there to keep things private." The judge turned his gaze to me. "Miss Ward, do you have a response?" Elias stood up, his presence filling the room. "Your Honor, we would like to submit Exhibit A. These are the encrypted badge logs from the architectural firm where my client is employed. They show she entered the building at 7:45 a.m. on the 14th and did not exit until 8:15 p.m. We also have high-definition lobby footage showing her entering and leaving." He walked the documents up to the clerk. "Furthermore, we have a certified statement from the building's parking garage confirming her vehicle's license plate was scanned in the garage for the entire duration of that 12-hour period. Unless my client has learned the art of bilocation, she was never at Pine Street." The room went silent. I could hear the sound of my mother's heavy breathing from across the aisle. My father's jaw tightened, a small muscle jumping in his cheek. Their lawyer looked down at the table, suddenly very interested in the grain of the wood. Judge Miller looked at the logs for a long time. Then he looked at the quitclaim deed. He reached for a magnifying glass on his desk and studied the notary stamp. "Mr. and Mrs. Ward," the judge said, his voice dangerously quiet, "I'm going to ask you one more time, and I want you to remember that you are currently under oath in a court of law. Did you witness your daughter sign this deed at the Pine Street property on the 14th? My father opened his mouth, but no sound came out. My mother looked at him, her eyes wide with a sudden sharp panic. They were realizing that the game had changed. They were realizing that the girl they had tried to crush had spent her time building a fortress of facts that their lies couldn't penetrate. "I need to see the notary's journal," the judge added, his eyes snapping to their attorney. "Where is Sarah Jenkins?" She's on her way, Your Honor," the lawyer stammered. The judge slammed his gavel down, the sound echoing through the room like a gunshot. She had better be, because if she cannot produce a journal entry for this signature that matches the time and date of this deed, I am referring this entire matter to the district attorney for a criminal grand jury. My mother made a small choked sound in the back of her throat. My father gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. I sat there, my spine straight, watching the facade of their lives crumble in the light of the truth. They had come for my house, my memories, and my future. But as I looked at the judge's face, I knew they were about to lose a lot more than a piece of real estate. The doors to the courtroom creaked open, and a woman who looked like she hadn't slept in 48 hours stumbled inside. Sarah Jenkins was clutching a black leather-bound book to her chest as if it were a shield, her eyes darting between my parents and the judge. She looked nothing like the professional notary I had imagined. She looked like someone who had just realized the Titanic was sinking, and she was holding a bucket. "Miss Jenkins, take the stand," Judge Miller commanded, his voice vibrating through the heavy wooden benches. She walked past me, the scent of stale cigarettes and cheap perfume trailing in her wake. She didn't look at me. She didn't even look at my father, who was staring at her with an expression that was half warning and half pleading. She took the oath with a trembling hand, her voice barely a whisper as she confirmed her identity. Judge Miller leaned over the bench, his eyes fixed on the black book in her hands. "Miss Jenkins, I have a quitclaim deed here for the property at 1224 Oak Lane. It bears your stamp and your signature. It claims you witnessed Clara Ward sign this document on the 14th of last month. Do you have a corresponding entry in your notary journal?" Sarah Jenkins swallowed hard, the sound audible in the silent room. I have my journal, Your Honor." The bailiff stepped forward, took the book from her, and handed it up to the judge. The room was so quiet I could hear the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock and the sound of my mother's rings clinking together as she wrung her hands. My mother's face was no longer triumphant. It was pale, the foundation on her skin looking like cracked plaster in the harsh fluorescent light. Judge Miller flipped through the pages, his brow furrowed. He stopped near the middle, his finger tracing a line of text. He looked at the journal, then at the deed, then back at the journal. He adjusted his glasses and leaned closer. "Miss Jenkins, your journal entry for this transaction lists a driver's license number for the signer Clara Ward. It ends in 4409. Is that correct?" Sarah nodded frantically. "Yes, Your Honor. I always check the identification." The judge turned his gaze to me. "Miss Ward, please stand and state the last 4 digits of your driver's license." I stood up, my back straight, my voice echoing with a clarity that surprised even me. "The last 4 digits of my license are 7126, Your Honor, and I have the physical card right here." I handed my license to the bailiff. As it was passed up to the judge, I saw my father's shoulders slump. He knew. He had probably used an old photocopy of my ID from a college application or an old tax return to give Sarah the numbers she needed for her book. But he had forgotten that I had renewed my license 2 years ago when I moved into the house. Judge Miller compared the 2 numbers and let out a long, slow breath that sounded like a tire leaking air. He looked at Sarah Jenkins, and the look was so cold it could have frozen the water in the carafe on the desk. "So, Miss Jenkins," he began, his voice dangerously soft, "you checked the ID of a woman who wasn't there, recorded a number that doesn't match the defendant's current license, and used a stamp that has been suspended by the Secretary of State. And you did all of this at a property on Pine Street that, according to the records provided by Mr. Thorne, is currently an empty construction site." Sarah's lip began to tremble. Her gaze flicked to my father, who was shaking his head almost imperceptibly. But Sarah was done being a foot soldier in a war she couldn't win. I wasn't at Pine Street," she blurted out, her voice cracking. "Mark told me to meet him at his office. He had the papers already signed. He said Clara was too busy at work and that he would take care of her. He said it was a family matter. He told me he'd pay me $500 just to stamp it and keep my mouth shut." My mother jumped to her feet. "She's lying. She's a drug addict and a liar. Mark, tell them." "Sit down, Mrs. Ward," Judge Miller roared, slamming his gavel down so hard that a glass on the clerk's desk rattled. One more outburst and I will have you removed and held in contempt." My mother collapsed back into her chair, burying her face in her hands. My father just stared at the floor, his face a mask of gray stone. The lawyer they had hired was busy packing his briefcase, clearly realizing that he was no longer representing a client in a civil dispute, but rather sitting next to two people about to be indicted for a laundry list of felonies. Sarah Jenkins started to cry, the tears smearing her mascara into dark tracks down her cheeks. "I'm sorry," she sobbed. "I needed the money. My house is in foreclosure, and Mark said it was just a formality. I didn't think it would hurt anyone." Judge Miller closed the journal and handed it back to the bailiff. "It has hurt a great deal of people, Miss Jenkins. It has hurt the integrity of this court, and it has nearly cost this young woman her home and her inheritance." He turned his attention to my parents. "Mark and Diane Ward, you came into this court claiming to be the victims of a non-paying tenant. You used a forged deed, a forged lease, and a compromised notary to initiate an illegal eviction. You then proceeded to trespass upon the property and remove personal belongings while an emergency stay was being processed." The judge leaned forward, his eyes boring into my father. "I want to know why. Why would a father do this to his own child? Why was it so urgent that you had to break every law in the book to get your hands on that equity?" My father didn't look up, but Elias Thorne stood up holding a thin blue folder I hadn't seen before. "If I may, Your Honor," Elias said. "My office ran a title search and a credit check on the plaintiffs this morning. It appears that Mr. Ward's commercial development on 4th Street is currently under a $3 million lien. He is 90 days past due on his primary business loan, and the bank was scheduled to begin foreclosure proceedings on his own residence tomorrow afternoon." The room went into a stunned silence. I looked at my father, the man who had spent his life lecturing me about family assets and financial responsibility. He wasn't trying to protect the family legacy. He was trying to cannibalize mine to save his own skin. He needed the $200,000 of equity in my house to buy himself another month of pretending to be a successful businessman. He stole from a dead man's granddaughter to pay for his own failures, Elias added, his voice dripping with a disgust that matched my own. Judge Miller shook his head, a look of genuine sorrow crossing his face. "I am issuing an immediate stay of the writ of possession. The judgment for eviction is vacated with prejudice. Furthermore, I am ordering a temporary restraining order against both Mark and Diane Ward. You are to stay 500 feet away from 1224 Oak Lane and from Clara Ward." He turned to the bailiff. "Take Miss Jenkins into the hallway and wait for the sheriff's deputies. And call the district attorney's office. I want a prosecutor here in 30 minutes. My mother looked up, her eyes wide. "We're going to jail." "That is for the district attorney to decide," the judge replied, his voice cold and final. "But as far as this court is concerned, you are no longer plaintiffs. You are subjects of a criminal investigation." As the judge stood to leave, the room began to move in a blur. Sarah Jenkins was led out in tears. My parents' lawyer scurried away without saying a word to them. My father finally looked at me. There was no apology in his eyes, no regret. There was only a cold, simmering resentment, as if I were the one who had betrayed him by refusing to let him rob me. "You always were a selfish brat, Clara," he whispered as the bailiff approached him to lead him out for questioning. "Your grandfather would be ashamed of you." I didn't flinch. "My grandfather is the one who gave me the tools to stop you," I said, my voice like iron. "He knew exactly who you were. That's why he didn't leave the house to you." I watched them being led out of the courtroom, my mother stumbling on her heels, still clutching those stolen pearls as if they could save her. I sat back down in the gallery, the silence of the room finally settling over me. Elias put a hand on my shoulder. "You did it, Clara. The house is yours, and after the DA gets through with them, they won't be bothering you for a very long time." But I wasn't thinking about the house. I was thinking about the video on my phone, the one where my mother was throwing my life into trash bags. I stood up and walked toward the doors, my heels clicking against the marble floor. I had to get back to Oak Lane. I had a home to clean and a lot of garbage to throw away. As I walked out into the bright afternoon sun, the world felt different. The air was crisp and the sky was a deep, brilliant blue. The nightmare that had started at 6 a.m. was over, but the work of rebuilding was just beginning. I got into my car and drove toward the neighborhood, passing the familiar parks and shops. When I turned onto Oak Lane, I saw the moving truck was gone, and the deputy sheriff was sitting in his patrol car at the curb waiting for me. He stepped out as I pulled into the driveway. "Miss Ward," he said, tipping his hat. "I just got the call from the civil unit. The stay is official. I've already told your father's movers that if they set foot on this grass again, they're going to jail for trespassing." "Thank you, Deputy," I said. I walked up the steps to my porch. The door was hanging open, the lock broken from when they had forced their way in. I stepped inside and looked at the living room. It was a mess. Furniture, moved boxes overturned the walls bare where my grandfather's clocks had once hung. But as I stood there in the middle of the chaos, I didn't feel defeated. I felt a strange, quiet power. I walked to the kitchen and found the crystal decanter my father had been drinking from. It was sitting on the counter, half empty. I picked it up, walked to the sink, and poured the expensive scotch down the drain. Then I took the decanter and placed it back in the velvet-lined cabinet where it belonged. I spent the next 4 hours putting things back. I hung the clocks. I straightened the rugs. I carefully unfolded my architectural sketches, smoothing out the wrinkles with the palm of my hand. Every movement felt like a reclamation. Every object I touched was being brought back into the light of the truth. Around 5 p.m., a courier arrived with a package from Elias. It contained the certified copies of the judge's order and a new heavy-duty deadbolt lock for the front door. I took my grandfather's toolbox from the garage and spent the next hour installing it myself. The sound of the metal bolt sliding into place was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. I sat down on the porch swing as the sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across the lawn. The neighborhood was quiet. The neighbors who had watched the morning's drama from behind their curtains were now coming out to water their lawns or walk their dogs, giving me small, hesitant waves. I looked at the "for sale" sign my father had put in the yard. It was lying face down in the dirt now where I had kicked it over on my way inside. Tomorrow I would call the landscaping company to come and fix the grass where the moving truck had rumbled over it. Tomorrow I would go to the recorder's office and make sure the title correction was finalized. But tonight I was just going to sit here and listen to the house. I could hear the floorboards settling, the hum of the refrigerator, the wind whispering through the eaves. It was the sound of a foundation that had held firm. It was the sound of a home that was finally, truly mine. I pulled my phone out and looked at the last text my father had sent me before the court hearing. It said, "Give it up, Clara. You've already lost." I didn't delete it. I saved it as a reminder of the day I found my own strength. I stood up, walked inside and closed the door, the new lock clicking with a solid, definitive sound. The light in the hallway was warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the gray fog of the morning. I walked to my grandfather's library and sat in his old leather chair. The room smelled of old paper and cedar, a scent that always made me feel safe. I reached out and touched the spine of one of his books, feeling the connection to the man who had seen this coming and had prepared me for it. He had always told me that a house is only as strong as the people who live in it. And as I looked around at the walls that had sheltered 3 generations of my family, I knew that I was exactly where I was meant to be. The battle had been won not with anger or violence, but with the quiet, persistent weight of the truth. And in the end, that was the only thing that mattered. The silence of the following morning was a different kind of quiet. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of a secret or the frantic silence of a woman trying to outrun a lie. It was the clean, open silence of a house that had been purged. I sat at the mahogany dining table, sunlight streaming through the tall Victorian windows, and watched the steam rise from my coffee mug. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like a guest in my own life. My phone buzzed on the table. It was a message from Elias Thorne. The district attorney has issued warrants for Mark and Diane Ward. Felony counts of deed fraud, perjury, and conspiracy. Sarah Jenkins has turned state's evidence in exchange for a suspended sentence. They are being picked up at their residence this morning. I set the phone down and looked at the empty chair at the head of the table where my grandfather used to sit. He would have been heartbroken by the greed, but he wouldn't have been surprised by the outcome. He had always said that truth is like water. It finds every crack, every hole, and eventually it levels everything in its path. An hour later, a dark sedan pulled up to the curb of 4422 Pine Street, the very house my mother had used as a staging ground for her deception. I wasn't there to see it, but Elias described the scene to me later. My father had tried to bluster his way out of the handcuffs, shouting about his reputation and his business contacts, until the lead detective reminded him that his reputation was currently being sold for 10 cents on the dollar at the county courthouse. My mother had simply gone quiet, her face pale and sunken, finally realizing that the pearls around her neck were no longer a symbol of status, but a weight that was pulling her under. The news of the arrests hit the local papers by afternoon. The headlines were brutal. Local developer and wife charged in massive real estate, fraud against daughter. My father's business associates, the same men who had laughed at his jokes and played golf with him at the country club, disappeared like smoke in a high wind. The bank moved forward with the foreclosure on their primary residence within 48 hours. I spent that evening walking through every room of 1224 Oak Lane. I touched the floral wallpaper in the guest room, the heavy brass fixtures in the bathroom, and the worn wooden banister of the grand staircase. I was looking for any trace of them that might still be lingering. I found a stray earring of my mother's under the radiator and a crumpled business card of my father's in the kitchen drawer. I didn't feel anger when I saw them. I only felt a profound sense of relief as I dropped them into the trash bin. The title correction process was finalized 2 weeks later. I stood in the county recorder's office once more, the same place where I had stood in a panic just 14 days earlier. This time, the clerk recognized me. She handed me the new certified deed with a small, knowing smile. "It's all clear now, Miss Ward," she said. "The fraudulent quitclaim has been struck from the record. This property is legally, officially, and exclusively yours." I thanked her and walked out into the crisp autumn air. I took a deep breath, the scent of dried leaves and wood smoke filling my lungs. I went home and spent the evening in the library, the room where my grandfather had spent his final days. I realized then that he hadn't just left me a house. He had left me a lesson in the architecture of integrity. He had built this place to last not just with bricks and mortar, but with a foundation of honesty that could withstand even the most vicious of storms. The legal battles would continue for months. There were depositions, hearings, and endless piles of paperwork to navigate, but the outcome was never in doubt. The record was louder than their manipulation. The evidence was stronger than their influence. And in the end, the truth didn't just win. It restored the order that my parents had tried so hard to destroy. I stood on my porch that night watching the stars come out over the neighborhood, and I knew that for the first time in my 23 years, I was exactly where I belonged. The door behind me was locked, the house was quiet, and the future was entirely mine to build. Standing on the threshold of this journey, looking back at the wreckage of what used to be my family, I have come to understand a truth that usually only reveals itself with time and gray hair. Family is often described as a circle, an unbroken line of blood and bone, but the reality is that family is a structure. Like any house, it requires maintenance, honesty, and a solid foundation. When the people who are supposed to be your roof and your walls become the very storm that tries to blow you down, you learn very quickly that biology is not a contract for loyalty. We often stay in toxic situations because we feel we owe something to the past. We tell ourselves that because someone gave us life, they have a permanent claim on our peace. But the greatest lesson I learned from my grandfather is that your true inheritance is not property or money, it is your character. He knew that the things we own are just temporary, but the way we treat people and the truth we stand for are the only things that endure. If you find yourself in a position where the people you love are asking you to sacrifice your integrity to protect their lies, remember that you are not a guest in your own life. You are the architect. You have every right to change the locks on anyone who tries to set fire to the foundation you are building. There is a specific kind of wisdom that comes from realizing that you do not have to beg to be treated fairly. You do not have to negotiate with people who use manipulation as a primary language. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stay quiet and let the record speak for itself. The world has a way of balancing the books, and while the process can be painful and lonely, the clarity that follows is worth every tear shed in the dark. It is okay to walk away from people who see you as a resource rather than a human being, even if those people are the ones who raised you. If this story resonated with you, or if you have ever had to fight to protect what is rightfully yours from the people you once trusted, please share your thoughts in the comments. I read every one of them, and your stories of resilience remind us all that we aren't alone in these battles. Make sure to hit the like button if you believe that the truth should always come to light, and please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next story of justice and redemption. Your support helps us keep sharing these powerful narratives of strength and the quiet power of the record. Thank you for watching, and